Welcome to One Symphony, a podcast that explores classical music's relevance in our modern lives. I'm conductor Devin Patrick Hughes, and I'm here to share with you stories and conversations with musicians, composers, and artistic entrepreneurs that aim to unite us into one symphonic world. Grammy-winner Jason Vieaux is described by NPR as the most precise and soulful classical guitarist of his generation, and by HuffPost as revitalizing the classical guitar. As a soloist and chamber musician for festivals like San Francisco Performances, Ravinia, Amsterdam's Concertgebouw, Seoul Arts Center, Shanghai Concert Hall, and featured soloist with the orchestras of Cleveland, Toronto, Houston, Nashville, and more, Jason is considered one of the world's leading classical guitarists. Jason just released Bach Volume 2, Works for Violin, on Azuka Records to critical acclaim, and Shining Night with violinist Anakiko Myers was released in May. He recently recorded Pat Metheny's Four Paths of Light on Metheny's 2021 album Road to the Sun, and won a Grammy in 2015 for Best Classical Instrumental Solo for his album Play. Jason was the recipient of the Guitar Foundation of America International Guitar Competition First Prize and holds faculty positions at Curtis and Cleveland Institutes of Music. Jason, it's so awesome to have you on One Symphony today. I wanted to ask you how you got started as a musician. Was it more by ear? I know you have a lot of experience with music of all genres. Was it more by ear or was it more traditional classical training?
Well, thank you for having me on the show, Devin. It's great to be here. And I think initially I probably knocked around on the guitar by ear. My mother bought me a guitar when I was 5, and it just so happened that it was a kind of a 2/3 size or 3/4 size classical guitar. And I don't think that either of my parents really knew there was such a thing as classical guitar, or that there was, say, a classical repertoire for it. So for a couple of years there, I was basically playing things by ear. And then the Buffalo Guitar Quartet, I was born and raised in Buffalo, New York, and the Buffalo Guitar Quartet came to my school. And that's where my mother was working at that time as a secretary. And so they gave this, kind of like an outreach performance in our cafeteria. And I would have probably just listened and watched that performance and went to my classes and maybe mentioned it to my mother had she been at home. But since she was there, she was proactive about going up to the members of the quartet and asking if any of them gave private lessons. And so I started lessons that summer with Jeremy Sparks. And that was like right around my 8th birthday, either right before it or right after.
So is that a common, I know like with violin, it's kind of like 4 to 5 sometimes, and even with piano. Is that kind of common with classical guitar as well, like that essential age range to start?
I think back then it was probably unusual because at that time we didn't have Suzuki guitar. There's no European style conservatory system in the United States, certainly not at that time. Perhaps now, like let's say if the Colburn School in Los Angeles wanted to start something and have people starting very young, they could do that. But, really not in the States at that time. It wasn't really until the development of, say, for example, the conservatory system in China, those players often start at 4 or 5 years old. But back in 1980, 81, that wasn't really something you really heard about. So it was kind of early for most classical guitarists. Most classical guitarists around that time came to it from rock and roll or from jazz or blues. A lot of the stories you hear is like, I heard a Segovia record or I heard a Julian Bream record and I said, I've got to see what's going on there, right? So since my teacher was a member of a classical guitar ensemble, and Jeremy Sparks was a really, very like a proper musician too, like a very, very literate, could write, could arrange, He was the primary arranger for the quartet. So not only did I study with somebody that could play and could teach the technique, the right hand fingers and fingerings and all that kind of thing, but we also played within a couple of years. We were playing duos together in the lesson. So I got kind of like an early chamber music training from him as well.
So you also said that earlier in life, you kind of looked at a lot of like rock music or pop musicians as a little bit easy. Like it's something that like you made the leap essentially directly to the classical guitar because presumably that was more of a challenge.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think as a teenager, yeah, I definitely, there was probably a period where I kind of thought there was a bit of an identity, kids at that age, you have a kind of an identity, and mine wasn't, since I wasn't playing soccer anymore, I had basically stopped playing sports because I didn't want to, hurt my hands or break my fingers or anything. And by the time I was 12 and so 13, 14, maybe that was it. It was a little bit like a badge of honor, like, oh, what Eddie Van Halen is doing isn't all that hard and da-da-da-da and this kind of thing. Because really, in order to play some of the repertoire I was already playing by then, concert pieces like Variations on a Theme of Mozart by Fernando Sor or Recuerdos de la Alhambra by Tarrega and these kind of things. Like my classmates didn't know anything about that stuff, right? So it was probably my way of communicating to them if they were curious about it, or they would ask too. Like I'd play in a school assembly or talent sort of thing. I'd play like the Grand Overture by Giuliani, and they were like, "Whoa!" I was like, and then of course it's like, can you play this? Can you play, Grateful Dead? Can you play Led Zeppelin? And I would be like, yeah, that stuff is like, I was like, yeah, that stuff is pretty easy compared to what I'm practicing. So. Yeah, but it wasn't anything of like, there was probably a little bit of me that I wanted to impress my friends at school too.
So you talked about Jeremy Sparks as sort of being this consummate musician, and I know that you also compose music. You have all this experience in music with very different styles. You teach, you play music on guitar that was written for other instruments. And I'd love to just kind of get into Johann Sebastian Bach because you have this incredible new Bach Volume 2 album that was just released.
Thank you.
Can you kind of talk about that continuation, that lineage of, and Bach didn't play the guitar, but he played the violin very well. But it's known that he also loved to play these partitas on the piano and the suites on the harpsichord. Can you kind of talk about that 400 years of history of performing music like this as a performer, but also as a composer and as a teacher, as Bach was?
Wow. Okay. Well, I'll do my best with that. As far as the other styles, I mean, I basically grew up around rock, soul, R&B, some funk music. I had a copy of Sly and the Family Stone Fresh album from 1973. So like when I was 5, 6 years old, I was listening to some pretty great stuff on that end of things. And then my dad's record collection was entirely jazz. Where the transcriptions come about, just to kind of cover that topic, is that the sound of jazz, the sound of R&B, sound of soul, and that kind of thing is kind of, it's very close to me because those are my earliest musical experiences, really. Classical music, of course, I learned to play through the guitar. So the language of the Baroque era, the language of the classical era was, I learned basically the language of classical era music, Mozart era music, through Fernando Sor and Mauro Giuliani. With Bach, I was starting my first Bach pieces when I was probably about 11. and they were two movements from the third cello suite. And the guitar's history in terms of repertoire goes all the way back to the Renaissance. Actually, its earliest ancestor is the vihuela, which was a four-coursed guitar. And when I say course, meaning it was doubled strings, so four doubled strings, so the pitches are doubled, and so it had 8 strings, but really only 4. You're really playing on 4-string guitar, basically. And so the music from that, there's some really wonderful music from that period. And then, of course, we have its cousin, the lute, from the Renaissance. Now, then as those two instruments developed, the lute became, of course, a lot more. The vihuela kind of graduated, if you will, more or less into a Baroque guitar. And while there's a lot of original, of course, material written for the solo Baroque guitar, for me, I mean, just being able to play music of the quality of Bach is really special. And so I always favor the transcriptions that we can do by Scarlatti or Handel or Bach or even Telemann and that sort of thing. So the Bach lute suites and now the violin sonatas and certainly the cello suites have for a long time now, been kind of a staple of the guitar's repertoire because they really require a certain amount of technical ability. Just to play the notes is one thing, but then to actually get across the detail of the polyphony on a guitar is extremely difficult.
And you came back to Bach because you have Bach Volume 1 about 13 years ago or so.
Yeah.
And Bach is sort of the father of everything we do in classical music and non-classical music in many ways. And for me, the most incredible thing about him is he wasn't writing in the sense that his music is going to be played for generations. He was just writing he had a church gig and it was a civic, there was a civic duty as well. So he wrote dances and then the fugues for the church and dances for the pub. And he wasn't thinking about, well, when is this music going to be played for the future? And that's why there's not much markings. The editions are hard to really find what he actually intended because he just wrote down enough for him and his musicians to be able to play it. And, it was discovered by Mendelssohn in the 1800s. And then, Pablo Casals discovered the cello suites in the 1900s. And I'm just sort of curious from your standpoint as a all-star globe-trotting guitar soloist, why keep coming back to this music? And, what does Bach have to say in 2022?
Well, I mean, his music is absolutely timeless. First of all, I mean, I just think the music itself has everything that music needs in order to function on all levels. I mean, it's got terrific rhythm. It's always melodic, of course, and that part of that is the style of music that they were writing in, the style of polyphony, where things function together and hang together as harmony, but each line, actually is melody unto itself. On its own, and great structure, like great narrative, like great natural musical narrative. There's always a nice architecture to things that seem to just make sense. And I just think that those are qualities that don't really become dated in any way. I mean, that was kind of borne out really, as you suggested. That was a really great actual kind of synopsis of how Bach kind of re-entered the culture in the 20th century too. There was kind of like a Bach revival once it was discovered by the more 20th century musicians on different instruments. But Mozart at the end of his life, the Grosse Fuge, and they are all kind of dealing, Schubert, all the great composers of the 19th century were really sort of, it's interesting that it was always near the end of their lives that they were really trying to deal with writing in that style. And to really make a statement, and to try to master the counterpoint that Bach, of course, had mastered long before them. wasn't a star like Handel. He was like this kind of provincial composer. So we're very lucky that the music even, got out,
Yeah, and as you talked about, but Mozart and Beethoven and Haydn, they had access through a lot of their wealthier patrons who kept these music libraries of sacred old music. They had access to this, and they used a lot of this, a lot of the structures, a lot of the harmonies, and the fugues, of course. And I'm curious about the dances. And you said Bach was a very provincial guy, kind of sequestered in northern Germany, as opposed to somebody like Handel, who was a world traveler. But for some reason, Bach was able to assimilate all these great, like in a suite or in a partita, you have all these different dances that are French, that are Spanish, that are Italian, that he was essentially able to, and I don't know if he heard them or, because we know Mozart
Yeah.
traveled all over the place, but he was able to kind of make these into the pedestal of what we know as the Western musical tradition. Can you talk about how you interpret dances, and how, when you think of tempo, when you think of style, when you think of phrasing, and I know you have on other recordings, for example, on Shining Night with Anna Kiko Myers, you play this Piazzolla, the history of tango. And when I think of tango or Spanish or South American dances, they're also related to the dances of the Bach partitas or suites. So can you kind of maybe talk about how you interpret that, how you bring those to life, and how you put your personal stamp on that?
I know what most classical musicians know, in the sense that a saraband, for example, like its origins are actually Mexico, and then traveling through Spain. In those days, it was kind of a very forbidden, or kind of a very sensual, like too sensual, kind of taboo kind of dance. And then of course you've got the jig, which is essentially kind of a variant, sort of a more, maybe in their hands and ears, a bit more of a refined version of the jig. But a lot of cultures have this kind of version of this rounded 2-beat kind of 6/8, jig or jig. And so, yeah, honestly, I wish I was a little bit more well-read in recent years in terms of the information of the where all these things came from. And I've always really just relied on my education as far as my training from, say, my conservatory training from John Holmquist as a teacher, and then a lot of master classes of visiting artists, and also the Baroque players like Paul Odette and Nigel North, and kind of picking up things from their master classes and also from their playing. And I did a fair amount of listening to Baroque musicians, meaning living Baroque musicians like Monica Huggett on the violin, try to widen my experience as a listener, which I was doing all the time anyway. Really, in my bachelor degree at CIM, I probably listened to as many hours of music a day as I practiced. I probably practiced 3 to 4 hours a day, and probably listened to music for 3 or 4 hours every day. So obviously, there's something that's coming from maybe that, from a lot of listening to music. But in the end, I'm really just using my instinct. I've not been the kind of musician to really kind of try to scour like a bunch of treatises and this kind of thing. Like when I'm doing ornamentation, I just doing something that I think sounds pretty good. It like sounds kind of like what I think, and I'm not trying to do something in any kind of modern way or modernize it. I'm hoping that I'm getting at something that is stylistically authentic, and at the same time, I don't really consider myself. I don't put myself out there as some kind of expert on it either. But I've also heard from a lot of musicians that play a lot of Baroque music that they really like my ornamentation. So, I don't know. I'm really just kind of doing what I think sounds right in the moment. And I have different, variations on the ornamentation that I can do here or there. When I start getting tired of a particular group of them, if I'm playing a piece in concert regularly, then I've switched them up or rotated them in and out and that kind of thing, to try to keep the improvisatory vibe that I think all of those musicians then were really adept at. What my understanding is that probably the best of those musicians were regularly improvising those ornaments. And I'm sure it was pretty easy for Bach to say, compose a double onto a gavotte or something like that, or a minuet or something like that, and double the rhythm. And it's kind of like a jazz musician sort of blowing over changes in double time of like a, over a mid-tempo swing or a ballad, right? Like that's really kind of like the American modern equivalent would be that kind of thing of the 20th century. It's like you're going into double time over the same changes. You have to have a composerly sense to you. I mean, when I did that Pat Metheny record, not this last one, the one of the piece that he wrote for me in 2005, I did a record entirely of music by Pat Metheny, like a solo guitar record of transcriptions, but they weren't all straight transcriptions. Like I took 5 of those pieces and kind of recast them as Baroque era dances, like a prelude. Of course, the prelude was "Last Train Home" by Pat's tune, and then an Alaman was a different tune, and then I wrote a double over a gavotte. What was that question? His jazz waltz time tune, question and answer. I basically made it into a kind of I think I made it into a gavotte, and then I wrote this double over the changes. And it didn't take long to do. It's just sort of like, oh, what would sound cool over these changes? I didn't even really spend very much time laboring over it. So I think that's kind of maybe in a little bit in that spirit. It's kind of like, oh, well, this would be fun. It's just, I don't think they were really taking it all that seriously either. If you have the ability to do it, you're not like, not even necessarily like we were suggesting about Bach. He wasn't trying to make any necessarily, just because his music is so great doesn't necessarily mean that in his mind he was trying to make these grand pronouncements or big statements. He had to crank that stuff out week to week. I don't even understand how he did it. It's amazing.
Can you talk about getting back to Pat Metheny and jazz and improvisation? I'd love to hear a little bit about how that collaboration happened. I know Pat Metheny created 4 Pats of Light for you specifically, and that's a common trend, over classical music. A lot of big name composers, whether they be Brahms or Tchaikovsky or Dvorak, almost always had a specific soloist in mind when they created their masterworks. Can you just talk about that collaboration and sort of the genres and worlds colliding and the language that you used to communicate as you were creating that?
Yeah, well, he wrote every note of it. And the idea was that I think from his perspective, he wanted to actually he wanted this kind of thing where the project or the challenge in front of him was to write something that was basically concert music. Certainly what Pat Metheny is known for is actually having a little bit more composed structures that soloists then have solo space in, where they're playing over changes, or there may be a composed head or tune, and then the piece for, say, like Pat Metheny group or something like that, or just for like a trio, might have like, or a quartet, has different sections in it, and they're not even, so the soloists aren't even blowing over those original changes in the head, they're blowing over some other set of changes. And so he had this sense of structure from the get-go, right? This kind of almost kind of the sense of a composed structure. And the ultimate, kind of expression of that for him, I think, was probably something like The Way Up, which is a 66-minute, basically one 66-minute piece that's incredibly complex and vast and has all kind of solo space and changes, and then things and recurring sections and recurring themes, and then things superimposed over each other. So, I mean, he definitely has this kind of mind, the mind to be able to do that. This was something, though, where there is no improvising on Four Paths of Light, the piece he wrote for me, whatsoever. And I think for him, the idea was like, I want to write something that's going to really challenge. He said, I want something that's going to really challenge you. I can't play it. I'm basically writing it for you, writing for you, and so, yeah, the first and third movements are really difficult. I mean, like, they're some of the most difficult things I've ever had to learn and play. And now, actually, coming out of this pandemic, I premiered it at 92nd Street Y in New York in April of 2021. That was at Kaufman Hall at the Y, but there was no one in the audience, right? It was just like a virtual concert. And so after that, I began to play it here and there. But I'm only really just getting to start playing it again in solo recitals. So actually, this whole summer, I'm playing it a lot. I'm playing about 5 or 6 times just in like 2 months. So that's kind of nice. But it needs these performances to kind of get to where you really get comfortable with it. I mean, I usually don't really feel all that comfortable with a piece anyway after 10, 15 run throughs. And this is definitely falls into that category.
And do you consider, we've all gotten used to the virtual performances with the cameras on and nobody in the audience. Do you consider that a similar kind of thing? Like, do you feel like that's a performance under your belt, or does it feel more like a recording session or something like that?
No, that first performance was, it's like the temperature was running high. Yeah. I mean, I was really nervous for it. It was like, I playing that piece for the first time. I mean, I didn't do any overdubs on my recital for that series. They allowed the performers, I guess. Well, I found out after the fact, they allowed the performers to actually do more than one take, even movements of things. When for some reason I never got that memo, and I was like, I did the first violin sonata, then the Cameron Negro by Brouwer, and then closed with Pat's piece, all in like one sitting, just like a regular concert. And so I was like really, like, the adrenaline was really, really flowing for that, for sure. Cause I just assumed that it was like a live thing. And then there's about 1,000 people that bought the tickets for it. I found out later. And it went great. I mean, I couldn't have asked for it to go any better. I mean, I really worked hard to get that ready so that it didn't sound like it's hard to take a piece that difficult and try to get it to where it doesn't sound like it's a first performance, but I didn't want to disappoint. I didn't want to disappoint Pat, really. I just didn't, I just wanted to try to make it as good as I possibly could. And that in itself, that first performance really, in a way, did kind of get it over the hump, because then like, especially that third movement, like, like, okay, I mean, at least I got a pretty good start on it. And then after performance 10, I'm expecting now it's going to go up. I'm expecting it's going to get, like, now it's easier to play. Like, when I practice it, it's easier to, I'm just using less pressure in the left hand. I found some little shortcuts in the fingering where I don't have to release a finger, or I can put down a finger later than I thought. Those are all things on a guitar, especially you're never stop discovering those kind of things. I've done the fingerings for the first violin sonata, for example, like three different times. The Prelude Fugue and Allegro 998, probably like five different times. I mean, that's just part of your own growth as you get better as a guitarist and get better as a musician. Like, you go, oh shoot, I didn't see that detail there in the polyphony. I want to bring that out, and I'm going to need this fingering to do it, right? as opposed to the fingering I played last time. So I never, it's scary to change your fingering like that, and then incorporate it in that next recital on stage. But I just think I sort of can't stop myself from doing that. It would just be weird to play the same fingerings I played of Prelude Fugue Allegro 995 that I did in college.
Yeah.
I just feel like I would feel like I was just being like a trained monkey or something like that. And then all the stuff I'd be hearing in my head, that's my problem sorry, I'm going off on a tangent now, but that's kind of my problem, is that I'm hearing things as I'm learning more about music and growing. I'm hearing things in great detail. And then whatever, it could be just two notes, but if those two notes, it's like, oh no, you could do this. Well, I'm going to do it. I'm going to change that fingering, and so that's why I feel like my Bach playing is getting better and better. And volume 2, hopefully, is kind of like a snapshot of like where I am today with that. I think I said something like that in the liner notes even.
And I think that's the great thing about not just Bach, but any great piece written at any time in history, is that it forces you to change, right? Like
Yes.
because of life experiences you have, you come back to that piece and you have to do something differently. Like it would be easy. It would be easy just to repeat, like just to do the same bit, right? I mean, everybody.
And that's understandable on guitar because it's already so damn hard to play this stuff anyway on it. So it's not like I totally understand, but I just can't. I can't do it. I can't it feels like you're frozen in time and you're going back to something as you were, rather than sort of living where it is with you now. Right.
That's why you're the Albert Einstein of the guitar world, right? Because Pat Metheny said, if you had Albert Einstein in your math department, you wouldn't want him to teach 8th grade algebra.
I love that quote. I mean, I think that's an unnecessarily nice thing to say about.
Well, you play the guitar and Einstein played the violin, right? So there's a difference.
He's like that about Antonio too, like his drummer, the drummer who played with him for years. He said the same thing about Antonio Sanchez.
Okay.
Like he's like the Einstein of the drum set, which he totally is. I mean, he's unbelievable.
That's an incredible compliment. I would love to hear a little bit about your teaching. You teach at Curtis and Cleveland Institutes of Music, and you're training the next generation of classical musicians who are going to sort of take the torch. You are clearly a holistic entrepreneur. You've got a family. You're teaching, you're composing. You've got this global career. Can you kind of talk about how you balance that overall and how you impart sort of the lessons of learn post-pandemic and by your 30-year career almost to the next generation?
Well, yeah, it's definitely a process. I mean, it's definitely a learning process. There's sometimes when it's all clicking, right, and it's all working in harmony with each other, like family, like I mean, whenever again, that's another sort of problem with me. It's like when I'm home, I'm home. Like I definitely practice, of course. But if I get, like, for example, if I'm home because of how much I travel, when I'm home, I get up first on their school days and I make their lunches and make their breakfast in the morning and get them up and brushing their teeth and this kind of thing. And I drive them to school and pick them up and take them to their lesson, their piano and guitar lesson, and they take dance lessons and they do swim class and stuff like that, right? So I try to then take over that kind of stuff because when I'm away, my wife is doing all of that, that family stuff. But also doing that stuff actually really bonds me much more with the kids than it would if I wasn't doing those things. And so we're all very, very close actually. And I saw but initially doing that, like kind of putting the guitar away for most of the day and then having to partition like a 3-hour time to get maybe 2.5 hours of practice in that day was like, it was kind of scary for me because, you still, the concerts are still rolling. Like you're still doing like, when my son was born, those first 2 years, I was doing like 60, 70 gigs a year, like 70, things of like 9 hours of repertoire. After the Grammy, I think I tried to reduce that just so that I wasn't running, so I wasn't burning the candle at both ends, right? You don't ever really want to get into a situation with that. So if you have some capital, if you will, to do that, and then I try to take advantage of that and not just so that I'm not working all the time, right? And over the pandemic, I also learned that relaxed time, like really time not doing anything, I wasn't really sure if I was capable of doing that, of actually not doing something that was going to result in some kind of artistic result or musical result. So like I wrote a bunch of music during that first year, first 6 months or something, like over like an hour of music. But that was nice because I play some of that stuff now in my concerts and my solo recitals. But the main thing I got out of that was it definitely made me reevaluate exactly what am I really, it helped me to actually really define, well, what exactly am I doing this for? And that even goes down to each contract. Like so what is the end game of doing this gig for this, right? Because it's like a blur after a while. Like you're just going year after year after year, and you kind of don't really stop. So then when you're forced to stop, I mean, when the pandemic hit, I lost all the concerts, or like all of us did, musicians did. They were, I don't know if I'm trying to remember how long that was for. I mean, it was about 6 months where I wasn't playing. I didn't really know what to do with myself, actually. I mean, meaning like I started to look at Instagram because I had someone doing Instagram for me. So I really never looked at it. And so I started to study that kind of thing, and I'd see other musicians and they were practicing just to practice. And I was like, gosh, I wish, I guess that's really, I mean, I was practicing, but I wasn't practicing like 4 or 5 hours a day. I didn't have any gigs. I mean, I was so trained by that point to prepare things, for public performance. I've sort of lost, I sort of lost myself for a second. I felt like a fish out of water initially, but then I started to get the hang of it, plus I was dealing with my parents kind of stuff too. So that there was a lot of family things that I had to really actually loose ends and stuff that I had to tie up and such with my dad. So,
And can you talk about kind of what you're training? I mean, obviously with your students, I mean, the technique, I mean, and me and probably you, we spend most of our time in school learning the music and the technique. And then when you get into the real world and realize that it's about maybe a little different for a conductor than a solo, musician. But it's about 50-50 of, I mean, maybe probably more on the developmental side, on the audience development. How can we creatively craft programs to bring in the next generation, bring in the people who don't come to the orchestral concerts? Can you talk about, what you're imparting to students in that arena?
Well, I mean, I think the students are doing a pretty good job of that actually on their own. I noticed that about 10, I would even say more, well, no, right around 10 years ago, because I'm trying to think like right around the time I met my wife was 2010. So even like 12 years ago, I started noticing at CIM that kind of students there were some students that were kind of taking that into their own hands, and they were scheduling concerts at bars, like at pubs and stuff like that. They were just going,
Bach.
yeah, Right. They were organizing themselves and going out into the community and starting like these small series and playing more house concerts too. Like, so that was already happening before the pandemic. There was a lot more of these kind of intimate house concerts, which would have been like a salon, right? Like a salon concert in the 19th century, like what Schubert would have had with a small group of friends or whatnot. So I think that kind of thing had already shifted pretty hard, and I think really the students were sort of doing that on their own, maybe in some cases with help from the instructors. But I mean, for me, my main job, I feel, is really trying to get them in the short time that they have with me as many of the tools musically and technically and performance wise and professionally, just general professionalism, as much as I can to get them before they're out of my studio and out into the world. So I mean, I've learned a lot just by watching them, like actually just watching just students and seeing what they're doing again. And also I had a lot of time on my hands to look at Instagram, and that was kind of like, oh, okay, so all this stuff is going on. I didn't really realize how much stuff was, because again, you're sort of in your own thing of you're really in this kind of week to week repertoire practice strategy, go over the game film from the last concert. How can I improve on this piece or whatever, this kind of thing. You're in your own zone, right? So there was some more time during the pandemic to look at that stuff.
Do you use recordings from your previous concerts that people send you? I mean, do you always try to get those, and does anything surprise you still?
Yeah, Pat's really, speaking of earlier, Pat Metheny, apparently he's really good about that stuff. Like, he listens to the shows. He really goes over talking about game film, right? Like watching the game, like a football team watching game film. Apparently he's really good. He's really disciplined about that. I don't enjoy listening to, and he doesn't either. He doesn't enjoy listening to his performances, and I don't get any particular enjoyment out of it. But I will, to see what that started happening again like 10, 15 years ago, where you had to approve an entire concert for broadcast. That can take for me like 2 to 3 hours because you rewind, you go, oh, and then it's like, oh, and it's kind of depressing. It's like, listening to all the things that that you could have done better, right? So I had to, over the last 15 years, really just by that process of releasing live performances for radio broadcast or television to do that. So I learned a lot from those kind of things, and it's always for the better, because if you find something that like you thought you might have been playing pretty well but doesn't sound so good, and it doesn't sound quite as good as you think, it's like, oh, okay, I may have to reevaluate how that I'm playing that passage, or how I'm actually crafting that passage on stage. Maybe I should take a little bit more time on that passage. That whole thing of like, I didn't realize I was playing those runs that fast.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't need to really be playing them that fast. What am I doing? Stuff like that, is kind of going through your mind. So
yeah, it's amazing how speed sometimes, even after doing it for so long, sometimes speed deceives you. Tempo deceives you. The actual, and I think part of that is the music's ability to kind of manipulate the space-time continuum a little bit.
yeah.
So because like an 80-minute Mahler symphony goes by when you're performing it in 5 minutes, I feel like.
Wow.
Maybe not so. I mean, don't you think, like, if you're doing a Bach suite, I mean, does that, do you have a sense of, do you even have a sense of time?
Right. That I understand what you mean by that, because early in my performing career, it did go by quickly, because adrenaline or nerves definitely has a way.
And maybe not 5 minutes. I was exaggerating.
No. I know what you're saying, though. I mean, what you mean is like, wow, it seems it goes over in like 25 minutes or a half an hour or something, right?
Yeah.
And that definitely doesn't happen so much with me anymore. Like, even if I have a little bit of nerves, like the 92nd Street Y concert where I played Pat's piece for the first time. I mean, I've been doing this for 30 years now. And so I think the past 10, I would say I'm pretty much inside of the music, right? Unless I'm really tired from some unforeseen circumstance, like like bad travel or something like that, bad travel schedule, or just, or too many gigs in a row or something. But the vast majority of the time, like I'm pretty, like it feels about as long as it is actually.
Nice.
I'm very much, but that's the zone I really want to be in. That's when it's really working right. And most of the time it feels like that. I think when it's right, it should feel like the length that it is. And that you're just a listener. You're just one of the listeners, like the audience is, except that you're doing more than just listening. Of course, you're directing. There's this nice zone where you're also just there. Like, it's great.
Yeah, that's a good place to be. An early teacher of mine said, "They cry, you don't," in regards to the audience.
Yep.
And I can experience music as a listener. And it can move me incredibly emotionally. That's why we do it. That's from the first memory I have is that. But as a kind of an overseer of the proceedings, it's very difficult to get into that listener mode. Because you're responsible for so much, and you're responsible for the experience of the musicians and then the audience. And I find that maybe I'll get there someday.
Yeah, it is definitely a nice place to be, and I'm happy that as I get older, it's much easier to get in that. Even with nerves, it's much easier to just kind of feel like I'm inside of what I'm doing.
Yeah,
it is harder with nerves because when you're nervous, you're often nervous about extraneous things that don't even have to do with music. Like it's hard, it's still, sometimes it's harder for me to play, say, a solo recital for a guitar society than it is for like a general classical music series or something like that. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of like they know every piece. They know, like half the audience has studied like a lot of the pieces or practiced them and that kind of thing. So it's a little bit, you kind of, even like if you kind of like through your peripheral, you're looking out there and like, the ones there's the guitarists sitting in the front and they're like this, the chin scratchers we call it, right?
Yeah. We have there was a notorious critic that would come to concerts, score in hand, like up in his face, sitting in the front row,
Man,
making sure every note is being played.
That's rough because that's like an exam. Yeah, it's like, is this person like examining me?
Yeah, my jury or something.
Yeah.
Well, I think that people are really they're not gonna find much to complain about in your newest recording of Bach Volume 2. I mean, I was listening to this over the past couple of weeks, and it truly just transports you to another world, as you talked about at the beginning of our discussion. And Jason, it's been such an honor and a pleasure to have you on One Symphony. And I hope everybody can check this out. It's Bach Volume 2, The Violin Works by Jason Vieaux, wherever you listen to your music. And of course, if you want to learn more about Jason, you can go to jasonvieaux.com and you can study with Jason. You can learn more about his compositions and everything about his upcoming performances. Thank you so much, Jason, for joining me on One Symphony today.
I appreciate it, Devin. I hope we can work together soon.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you for joining us to kick off our third season on One Symphony. Thanks to Jason Vieaux for sharing his music and wealth of knowledge. The albums you heard today include Jason Vieaux's J.S. Bach Violin Works, Volume 2, arranged for guitar on Azaka Records. You also heard the Laureate series, Guitar Recital by Jason Vieaux on Naxos, and you heard Pat Metheny's Road to the Sun by Metheny Group Productions and BMG Rights Management. You can check out Jason's music wherever you listen to your music and online at jasonvieaux.com. You can always find more info at onesymphony.org, including a virtual tip jar if you'd like to support the show. Thank you to new supporters Rusty, Catherine, Julia, and Arnett for making this episode possible. Please feel free to rate, review, or share the show. Until next time, thank you for being a part of the music.